The cold marble of the tomb had not yet completely sealed the echo of her last breath, and already legend, that tireless weaver of destinies that transcend the flesh, was beginning to intertwine its golden and bloody threads around her name, Inés. Imagine the scene if your fortitude and your soul's capacity to contemplate the macabre allow you to. A regal hall, probably an austere Coimbra or in the sacred Alcabasa, decked out not for the splendor of life, but for a grotesque parody, a solemn and terrifying pantomime of it. On the throne, not the vibrant pomp of a living queen, but the icy rigidity, the cerulean pallor of an exhumed corpse, rescued from the darkness of its first grave. Her body, or what remained of it after years of decomposition, was carefully washed, anointed with balms that could barely conceal the stench of death, and dressed in the most sumptuous brocades, the finest silks, and jewels that she could never wear, while the breath of life coursed through her veins. And before her, before that effigy of death enthroned, a court of terrified nobles, their faces as pale as that of their deceased queen, forced by the iron will of a mad king to bend their knees, bow their heads, and kiss the fleshless, jeweled, and cold hand of the woman who had once been Inés de Castro, the Galician mistress, the mother of his bastard children, now, by a decree born of the deepest pain and the most implacable vengeance, proclaimed Queen of Portugal. What unfathomable depths of passion, what abysses of refined cruelty can be harbored in the heart of a man, even a king, to conceive and carry out such an act? Was it perhaps a twisted form of poetic justice, the manifestation of madness unleashed by grief, or the most brutal and defiant assertion of power that dared to amend the designs of the grim Reaper himself, to impose his will on the corruption of the grave? This is the chronicle not only of a love that blossomed impetuously in the threatening shadow of betrayal and reason of state, but also of a young and beautiful life cut short with the coldness of steel by those who feared its influence. It is the story of a revenge that transcended the limits of what is humanly imaginable, culminating in the most bizarre, the most shocking, and undoubtedly the most macabre coronation in the entire history of European royalty. Prepare yourselves, then, to descend into the depths of one of the most tragic and fascinating medieval legends, the story of Inés de Castro, the queen who reigned after death, the woman whose heart, symbolically torn out by her executioners and literally yearned for by her royal lover, continues to beat strongly in the collective imagination as the purest and most heartbreaking emblem of eternal love and the unfathomable cruelty to which power can descend when it feels threatened. Her tragedy is a dark mirror, reflecting the most elemental passions and coldest calculations that have pulled the strings of history. To fully understand the tragedy that befell the delicate figure of Inés de Castro and the tormented soul of Prince Pedro of Portugal, we must transport ourselves with our imagination to the Iberian Peninsula in the mid-14th century. It was a turbulent time, a complex mosaic of Christian kingdoms, Portugal, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, embroiled in an intricate and often bloody web of dynastic alliances, border rivalries, and internal struggles for political and territorial supremacy. All this while the long and arduous undertaking of the Reconquista against the last bastions of Muslim power in the south still set the pace for politics, spirituality, and warfare, defining identities and forging characters. Portugal, a relatively young kingdom compared to its neighbors, but endowed with an indomitable Atlantic vocation and a vigorous spirit of independence, fought valiantly to consolidate its borders, its autonomy, and its own identity in the face of the ever-present and often threatening shadow of the Crown of Castile, its older sister in geography and history, but also its main rival. In this high-stakes political arena, where every move was carefully calculated and every decision could have far-reaching consequences, royal marriages were key pieces in the intricate chess game of power. They were state contracts, strategic alliances, instruments for securing peace or preparing for future expansion. Love, that very human and often irrational feeling, was a luxury that few princes and princesses could afford when duty to their lineage, the crown, and the kingdom dictated marriages of convenience, often with strangers or even yesterday's enemies. It was in the year of grace 1340 when she arrived at the Portuguese court, then frequently established in Lisbon or Coimbra, as part of the large and distinguished entourage of Doña Constanza Manuel de Villena, a Castilian noblewoman of the highest lineage, granddaughter of King Ferdinand III the Saint, destined to marry the Infante Don Pedro, heir to the throne of Portugal. A young Galician lady whose beauty and nobility would not go unnoticed, Inés de Castro. Daughter of Don Pedro Fernández de Castro, nicknamed El de la Guerra, the one from the war. An influential and powerful Galician magnate with strong ties and possessions both in Galicia and at the Castilian court, and Doña Aldonza Lorenzo de Valadares, a Portuguese lady of ancient lineage. Inés was neither an upstart nor an unknown in the circles of power. Her lineage was impeccable, related to the royal houses of Castile and Portugal. But it was her beauty, sung and praised by the chroniclers of the time and by poets of centuries to come, that made her a legendary figure. She was, according to accounts, one of those beauties who ignite uncontrollable passions and unleash storms in the hearts of men. Blonde hair like the gold of Almico or the ripe wheat fields of her homeland, eyes as deep and serene as the Atlantic Ocean that bathed the Galician coast, and a natural grace, a distinguished bearing, and a sweetness of manner that distinguished her notably among the ladies of the court, who were often more concerned with intrigue and protocol. Infante Don Pedro, a young man of about 20, impetuous, vehement, passionate to the extreme, and little given to the hypocrisy and cold conventions of palace life, was captivated, fascinated, almost bewitched by Inés's beauty and charm, practically from the first moment their eyes met. While his legal wife, Doña Constanza Manuel, fulfilled her dynastic duty, giving him a legitimate son, the future King Ferdinand I, in 1345, thus ensuring the continuity of the line of succession, Pedro's heart had already found its true north, its emotional anchor, in the figure of the Galician lady. What began, perhaps, as an irrepressible physical attraction, an aesthetic fascination with her dazzling beauty, soon turned into a deep, absorbing, and clandestine love, a love that defied the rigid moral norms of the church, the ironclad social conventions of the nobility, and, above all, the dangerous political expediencies of the time. They met in secret, at first with the discretion imposed by the presence of the Infanta Constanza, in the shady gardens of the palace, in discreet alcoves far from prying eyes and indiscreet ears, weaving a sentimental bond that, over time, would become stronger, more indestructible than any dynastic chain or oath of state. But at court, that microcosm of whispers and glances, secrets have butterfly wings and spread with the speed of the wind, and walls, no matter how thick, always seem to have ears. The passionate idyll between the heir to the throne and his wife's beautiful Castilian lady soon came to the attention of King Alfonso IV, Pedro's father, an experienced monarch with an austere, pragmatic character and fiercely jealous of the independence and stability of his kingdom, for which he had fought so hard. For Alfonso IV, nicknamed the Brave, his son's adulterous relationship was not simply a moral scandal, a stain on the reputation of the royal house, but a political threat of the first order, a potential source of serious complications for the future of Portugal. Inés was Castilian, and her brothers, Álvaro Pires de Castro and Fernão Ruiz de Castro, were ambitious, influential figures with considerable military power in the court of Castile, a kingdom that, despite family ties, was always viewed with suspicion and mistrust by Portugal, due to its constant attempts to exert hegemony over the entire peninsula. Fearing that the Castro brothers would use Inés's privileged position as the heir's lover to advance their political careers, obtain favors and privileges, or worse, to tip the balance of Portuguese foreign policy in favor of Castilian interests, began to sow the seeds of discord and mistrust in the minds of the king and his advisors. Furthermore, the existence of such a public and notorious love affair between the heir and his mistress, while his legitimate wife was still alive and fulfilling her duties, undermined the moral authority of the crown, set a dangerous precedent of indiscipline, and could be interpreted as an affront to the Infanta Constanza herself and her powerful lineage. The first signs of tragedy, like dark clouds in a summer sky, began to appear on the horizon. King Alfonso IV, instigated by his closest advisors and a significant part of the Portuguese nobility, who viewed with deep suspicion the growing influence of the Castros and Pedro's passion for Inés, tried by every means at his disposal to separate the lovers. The possibility of marrying Inés to a lesser nobleman of the court, sending her back to Castile under any pretext, or even locking her up in a convent was considered. But Pedro's love, stubborn, defiant, and already deeply rooted, vehemently resisted any imposition, any attempt at separation. The atmosphere at court became increasingly tense, charged with tension and underground intrigues, and the shadow of misfortune, still vague but perceptible, began to loom over the beautiful and unhappy Inés, whose only crime, in the eyes of the world and of reason of state, was to love madly and be loved with the same intensity by the future King of Portugal. Fate, with its often cruel and ruthless irony, had already begun to weave, with threads of passion and steel, the fabric of its tragic and unforgettable ending. The downward spiral, that whirlwind of passions, intrigues, and fears of the state that would drag Inés de Castro toward her fateful and bloody destiny, accelerated vertiginously with an event that, paradoxically, at first glance could have been seen by the two lovers as an open door to liberation, as the end of an obstacle: the death of Doña Constanza Manuel, the legitimate wife of Prince Pedro, in 1345, shortly after giving birth to their third child, Prince Fernando, who would eventually become King Fernando I of Portugal, the last of the Borgosa dynasty. With the disappearance of the figure who legally occupied the place of his wife, Pedro felt, or wanted to feel, free to give free rein, without pretense or restraint, to the passionate love he felt for Inés. He flatly refused, with his characteristic stubbornness, to enter into a new marriage of convenience, as demanded by his father, King Alfonso IV, and the cold and impersonal logic of state, which saw a new marriage alliance as an opportunity to strengthen Portugal's position in the complex European chessboard. Instead, openly defying his father's authority and the pressures of the court, Pedro intensified his relationship with the Galician lady, taking her to live with him in a more or less official capacity. He settled her in Coimbra, a city he frequented and loved, first in the city's royal palace itself, and later, perhaps seeking greater privacy and refuge from critical eyes, in a beautiful country house on the outskirts, in an idyllic setting next to the monastery of Santa Clara a Velha, on the banks of the Mondego River. That place, the setting for their love and later their tragedy, would be christened by popular legend, with a melancholy that lingers to this day, as the Quinta das Lágrimas, House of Tears. There, in that haven of apparent peace, among the leafy trees and the constant murmur of the river, Pedro and Inés lived for almost a decade in relative happiness, a kind of pastoral idyll, an enchanted interlude that contrasted violently with the political storm and court intrigues that were brewing around them, with increasing intensity. From this union, considered morganatic by most of the nobility and by the church, since there was no public record of a canonical marriage, although some later chroniclers, clearly influenced by the official version that Pedro would impose after Inés's death, suggest that the two were secretly married in Braganza, in a discreet but valid ceremony. 4 children were born: Alfonso, who died as an infant, Juan, Dionisio, and Beatriz. These children, although deeply loved by their father, who never hid his affection for them, were seen by much of the Portuguese nobility, and especially by King Alfonso IV, as a potential source of serious dynastic conflicts in the future. The existence of these royal bastards, as they were contemptuously called by their detractors, posed a direct and tangible threat to the legitimacy and succession rights of Prince Ferdinand, the heir born of the legal marriage to Constance Manuel. It was feared, and not without reason given Pedro's passion for Inés and her children, that once Pedro ascended to the throne, he would try by all means to legitimize his children with Inés, perhaps even naming them his successors to the detriment of Fernando, which would inevitably plunge the kingdom into a bloody civil war. In addition to this dynastic concern, the influence of Inés's brothers, the powerful and ambitious Castilian nobles Álvaro Pires de Castro and Fernán Ruiz de Castro, continued to be a source of deep and growing concern for the king and the circle of advisors around him. These two figures, skilled in the use of arms and in the tortuous game of court politics, not only frequently visited their sister in Coimbra, thus maintaining a direct channel of communication with the heir to the Portuguese throne, but also, thanks to the evident favor and protection of Prince Pedro, began to occupy positions of importance and exert increasing influence in the Portuguese court. For many Portuguese nobles of ancient lineage, jealous of their privileges and deeply nationalistic, this was an intolerable affront, a dangerous Castilianization of the court that threatened the independence of the kingdom and the interests of the local nobility. The murmurs of discontent against Inés and her family turned into open clamor, into veiled accusations of conspiracy and treason. The pressure on King Alfonso IV to take drastic and definitive measures against what they considered a nest of Castilian vipers in the heart of Portugal increased considerably. The monarch, although he seems to have felt a certain affection for Inés in the early days, and was aware of the deep love his son had for her, which made him hesitate to act too harshly, found himself increasingly cornered by circumstances and by the self-serving but no less persuasive arguments of his most influential advisers. Among these were three sinister figures who would go down in history as Inés's executioners: Pero Coelho, a cunning and ambitious man; Álvaro Gonçalves, a renowned jurist but cold-hearted; and Diogo López Pacheco, a nobleman of great power and influence. These three men, driven by a mixture of misguided patriotism, fear of losing their own positions of power, and perhaps a genuine concern for the stability of the kingdom, became the main instigators of the conspiracy that was being woven in the shadows against Inés's life. They painted a bleak and apocalyptic picture for the king. If Inés de Castro remained alive, if her influence over the future King Pedro continued to grow, and if her children continued to be raised in the shadow of royal favor, Portugal would inevitably head toward a succession crisis with unpredictable consequences, toward anarchy, and possibly toward submission to Castile. The only solution, they whispered insistently in the ears of the elderly and troubled king, was to eliminate the root of the problem in the most expeditious manner possible. Inés de Castro had to die. In a last-ditch attempt to calm the nobility and remove Inés from the center of political intrigue, King Alfonso IV ordered her exile to Albuquerque Castle, a fortress located on the inhospitable border with Castile. But this forced separation, far from extinguishing Pedro's love, only served to fan the flames with the force of desperation. The prince, devastated by the absence of his beloved, moved heaven and earth, using all his influence and contacts until he got Pope Clement VI himself to intercede with the Portuguese king so that Inés could return to Portugal. The brief exile served only to demonstrate the unbreakable bond between the lovers and Pedro's iron determination not to give up Inés under any circumstances. However, Inés's return to Coimbra, which Pedro celebrated as a victory, far from meaning a respite or a solution, only sealed his death sentence. For his enemies, her ability to influence the heir to the throne, even from the distance of exile, was the definitive and irrefutable proof that she represented a danger that could no longer be ignored or underestimated. Inés's situation, despite Pedro's unconditional love, was becoming increasingly precarious and dangerous. Although she had the passionate protection of her lover, he was not yet king, and his power to defend her from her father's machinations and the growing hostility of the court was ultimately limited. Inés lived in a gilded cage in her Quinta das Lágrimas, surrounded by the love of her children and Pedro, but increasingly isolated from the outside world, painfully aware of the hateful glances, hostile silences, and poisonous whispers that pointed to her as the cause of all the kingdom's ills. Despair, anguish, and constant fear began to take their toll on her spirit, even though she tried to hide it behind a facade of apparent serenity. She knew, with the intuitive certainty of someone who feels cornered, that her life was hanging by a very thin thread, a thread that the enemies of her love were determined to cut sooner rather than later. Paranoia, perhaps entirely justified in those circumstances, may have taken hold of his spirit, making him see enemies in every shadow, ominous omens in every ambiguous word, in every prolonged silence. The relentless downward spiral grew ever tighter, and the dark abyss of death opened up at his feet, inexorable, hungry, and ever closer. The shadow of the executioner, that intangible but terrifying presence that had been gradually lengthening over the figure of Inés de Castro, began to loom tangibly and relentlessly as the year 1354 drew to a close, and the first weeks of the fateful year, 1355, began to appear on the calendar. King Alfonso IV, a man who had devoted most of his long and turbulent reign to the arduous task of consolidating the independence, security, and prosperity of the Kingdom of Portugal, found himself at a terrible crossroads, faced with a dilemma that tore at his conscience as a father and his responsibility as a monarch. On the one hand, filial love, though deeply eroded and strained to the limit by his son Pedro's constant disobedience, defiance, and open rebellion in everything concerning Inés, made him doubt, hesitate, and retreat from the idea of taking such a drastic, so irreversible and so cruel against the woman his heir loved with a passion bordering on obsession. On the other hand, cold and relentless reason of state, that supreme argument that often demands inhuman sacrifices on the altar of the common good, shouted insistently that the survival of his lineage on the throne, the internal peace of the kingdom, and the preservation of Portuguese sovereignty in the face of Castilian ambitions required a painful but necessary sacrifice. His most trusted advisers, the aforementioned Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco, did not cease in their pernicious work of undermining him, whispering poisonous arguments in his ear, presenting Inés not as a simple lover of the prince, but as a dangerous and cunning agent of Castilian influence, a manipulator who used her beauty and charm to dominate Pedro's will, a potential usurper of the legitimate succession rights of the infant Fernando, and ultimately the primary cause of the rebellion, misrule, and irresponsibility of his son and heir. They argued, with the vehemence of those who feel they possess the absolute truth, or who defend unconfessable interests, that the nobility was restless and divided, that the common people were murmuring and disapproving of the prince's conduct, and that if action was not taken quickly, decisively, and with exemplary force, Portugal could be dragged into a bloody civil war over the succession after the king's death, or worse, fall under the orbit of the ever-ambitious and powerful crown of Castile. The moral dilemma that gripped King Alfonso IV's soul was therefore immense, almost unbearable. The chronicles of the time, although sparse in intimate details, describe him as a man deeply tormented by doubt, spending entire nights awake, pacing the cold corridors of his palace, weighing in his mind the terrible alternatives before him, each more painful than the last. Should he sacrifice a woman whose only proven fault was to love too much and be too loved, and with her the happiness and loyalty of his own son, for the sake of a supposed greater good, the stability and security of the kingdom? Or should he risk, out of excessive clemency or paternal weakness, that his worst fears would come true, allowing the influence of the Castro brothers to grow unchecked in the court, and the succession to the throne to be threatened by the existence of the bastard children of Pedro and Inés? The pressure exerted by his advisers was constant, suffocating. Finally, after much hesitation, after many internal and external debates, and according to some historians, taking advantage of a strategic absence of Prince Pedro, who was on one of his usual hunting trips, far from Coimbra and unable to protect Inés, the king made the fatal and irrevocable decision. Yielding to the entreaties of his advisers, or perhaps finally convinced by his own fears and an exaggerated sense of duty as monarch, Alfonso IV gave his tacit or explicit consent to end the life of Inés de Castro. The conspiracy, hatched over months in the dark and cold corridors of power, amid whispers and knowing glances, began to take shape with frightening speed once royal approval had been obtained. The plan, in its conception, was simple and brutal. The king, accompanied by his three main advisers and a small but determined armed escort, would travel to Coimbra, where Inés lived in the Quinta das Lágrimas, and there, far from the court of Lisbon and any possible interference, the sentence would be carried out without further delay or hesitation. Meanwhile, in her refuge in Coimbra, Inés lived in almost total ignorance of the death sentence that already hung over her head, although she was not entirely unaware of the vague dangers that lurked around her and the hatred that her figure aroused in certain sectors of the court. Her life in the country house, although apparently idyllic and protected by Pedro's love, was woven in its final days by a growing melancholy, a feeling of isolation, and a vague but persistent fear. The days passed, monotonous and fraught with foreboding, between caring for her young children, to whom she clung with the strength of a lioness, and lonely walks through the beautiful gardens bordering the Mondego River, whose waters seemed to whisper incomprehensible warnings to her. The joy and carefreeness of yesteryear had been overshadowed by the uncertainty of the future and the growing isolation to which she was being subjected. She knew, because the news, although filtered, reached her ears, that she was hated by an influential part of the Portuguese nobility, and that her love for Pedro was considered not only a scandal, but a serious threat to the stability of the kingdom. Perhaps she received sporadic alarming news from friends or loyal servants who still remained at court, or perhaps it was simply her keen feminine intuition, that sixth sense that sharpens in the face of danger, that warned her of the imminence of misfortune. It is said that she spent long hours praying in the chapel of the nearby convent of Santa Clara, seeking divine comfort for her troubled soul and heavenly protection for herself and her innocent children. Pedro's inability to protect her effectively, despite his unconditional love and his status as heir to the throne, was a constant source of anguish and unease for Inés. He could challenge his father with angry words, even veiled threats of rebellion, but as long as Alfonso IV remained the anointed and crowned king, the last word, the final decision on life and death, was his. And that word was now irrevocably stained with the intention of death. The days leading up to the fateful 7th of January 1355 must have been psychological torture for the unfortunate Inés, an endless succession of dark premonitions and barely contained fears. Every unfamiliar noise in the night, every stern face of a servant, every prolonged absence of news from Pedro must have fueled her worst nightmares, her darkest premonitions. She clung to her children like a shipwrecked woman to a plank in the middle of a raging storm, searching in their innocent laughter and childish hugs for a glimmer of hope, a reason to believe that fate would not be so cruel, so relentless. But the deterioration of her situation was already unstoppable. The machinery of death, once set in motion by royal will, advanced with the cold precision of clockwork, and nothing and no one in the kingdom seemed capable or willing to stop it. The assassins, with the king's blessing, were already sharpening their daggers and their consciences, and Alfonso IV himself, his heart surely shrinking with paternal grief that he could not or would not express, but with the iron will of a monarch convinced of his duty, prepared to commit the act that would forever stain the memory of his reign and unleash the fury of his son in a way that neither he nor his astute advisers could even begin to imagine. The shadow of the executioner was no longer a distant and vague threat. It loomed, dense and tangible, directly over the rooftops of the Quinta das Lágrimas, ready to deliver its deadly blow and silence Inés's voice and laughter forever. She, the beautiful and unfortunate Galician lover, found herself essentially alone, surrounded only by the vulnerable innocence of her children, waiting, without knowing for sure but sensing it with dread, for the imminent arrival of her executioners. Her isolation from the outside world was almost total, her vulnerability to the king's power, absolute. There would be no desperate attempts to save herself by fleeing, no last heroic resistance with a sword in her hand. Only the harsh, naked, and pathetic reality of a defenseless woman, whose only shield was her tears and her children, facing the cold and ruthless cruelty of reason of state. The day marked by destiny for infamy, January 7th, 1355, a date that would be engraved in blood in the annals of Portugal, dawned in Coimbra with a leaden and sad light, as if the sky itself, moved by the innocence of the victim, foretold the tragedy that was about to unfold on earth. King Alfonso IV, accompanied by his 3 closest advisers, who on this fateful day would act more as executioners of souls and enforcers of an unjust sentence than as prudent advisers, Paco Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco, followed by a small but determined armed escort, had left Montemoro Velho, where the court was temporarily established, and set off for Quinta das Lágrimas, Inés's refuge. The journey, although relatively short in distance, must have been fraught with a somber, almost suffocating tension. One can imagine the king, his hair already gray, and his face furrowed with the worries of government, silently struggling with his last remorse, perhaps evoking the image of his son Pedro, or that of the grandchildren he was about to leave motherless. And at his side, the 3 advisers, reassuring each other of the urgent necessity and supposed justice of the act they were about to commit, silencing any hint of doubt or pity that might arise in the monarch's heart. Meanwhile, in the country house on the banks of the Mondego, Inés de Castro, completely unaware of the sinister procession approaching with murderous intentions, spent the early hours of the morning in the company of her young children. Later chronicles, and the legend that has been so carefully woven around them over the centuries, paint a picture of domestic serenity, innocence, and maternal tenderness, which makes the contrast with the violence that was about to unfold even more heartbreaking and brutal. It is said that she was in the gardens, enjoying the cool morning breeze, near the fountain that today bears her name, the Fonte dos Amores, whose waters, according to popular tradition, sprang from her tears or were stained with her blood. Or perhaps she was inside the house, in a sunny room, teaching her little ones to read or singing them softly, some sweet and melancholic song from her distant Galician homeland. The news of the king's unexpected arrival at the gates of the farmhouse must have taken her completely by surprise, and perhaps at first she even harbored a fleeting and tremulous hope in her heart. Would the monarch come to negotiate, to listen to her reasons, to offer some negotiated solution to the conflict that was causing so much pain? Perhaps, in a gesture of magnanimity, he had come to show clemency, to forgive her supposed faults? The harsh reality, however, would brutally shatter any glimmer of hope in a matter of minutes. When Alfonso IV and his sinister henchmen burst into the country house, unannounced and without hesitation, the atmosphere was charged with a deadly electricity, a palpable terror. Inés, seeing the stony faces and icy stares of the advisors, sensing the threatening presence of the armed escort, understood instantly, with the clarity that extreme fear brings, the gravity of the situation and the dark purpose of that visit. Without thinking twice, moved by the most basic maternal instinct, she ran to meet the king, not to challenge him or rebuke him, but to beg, to plead for his life. And she did so in the most moving and desperate way a mother can conceive. She threw herself at the monarch's feet, clinging to his knees, and presenting her young children, the king's own grandchildren, as human shields against the imminent aggression, as the supreme and irrefutable argument for their innocence and the cruelty that was about to be committed. The words that tradition, embellished by the pens of poets and playwrights, puts into Inés's mouth in that supreme moment are a heart-rending lament, a plea that transcends the centuries. Lord, for the love of Christ, have mercy on me. If my mistakes, if my love for your Son, deserve punishment, let your justice fall on my head, but do not be cruel to one who has never offended you or wished evil on your kingdom. Look at these children, Lord, blood of your blood, flesh of your flesh, your innocent grandchildren, who with their tears and outstretched hands beg you for mercy for their unfortunate mother. If you must kill me, if my death is necessary for the peace of Portugal, let it at least be far from their innocent eyes, so that they do not grow up with the indelible memory of such a horrible spectacle, so that the image of their murdered mother does not torment their dreams for the rest of their lives. The scene must have been of unbearable dramatic intensity, a true emotional Calvary. The children, frightened by the suddenness of events and their mother's anguish, were crying inconsolably, clinging tightly to her skirts. Inés, her legendary beauty marred by tears of terror and supplication, her hair disheveled, her voice broken with emotion, begging for mercy with the desperate eloquence of someone who knows they are on the brink of the abyss. And King Alfonso, the feared bravo, faced in the most direct and cruel way with the living image of his own tyranny, seeing in the terrified faces of his grandchildren the reflection of the innocent blood he was about to shed. For an instant, just a fleeting instant, legend has it that the old king's heart of stone wavered. The sight of those innocent children, his own flesh and blood, begging with gestures and babbling for their mother's life, seemed to move him deeply. It is said that he was on the verge of giving in, of forgiving, of revoking the sentence, of turning around and leaving Inés in peace, perhaps exiled, but alive. But his advisors, mainly Paco Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves, fearing that the monarch's sentimental weakness would ruin their carefully crafted plans and expose them to Pedro's future vengeance, intervened swiftly and with calculated cruelty. With harsh words and fallacious arguments about reasons of state, they reminded the king of the supposed dangers lurking in the kingdom, the constant threat from Castile, the instability that a disputed succession would cause, and the need for an exemplary punishment to restore royal authority. Diogo López Pacheco, more cunning and subtle, perhaps appealed to the king's honor, to his word, to the impossibility of backtracking once a decision of such magnitude had been made. The scales, which for a fleeting moment seemed to tip timidly toward mercy and clemency, fell back with all their inexorable weight on the side of death. Alfonso IV, his soul surely broken into 1,000 pieces, but his fatal decision reaffirmed by the relentless pressure of his men, turned his gaze away from the heartbreaking scene of Inés and her grandchildren, and with a silent gesture or a barely whispered word, gave the agreed signal to the executioners. What followed was a brief but horrific slaughter, an act of barbarism unworthy of a Christian king. The designated killers, Paco Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and, according to some sources, although he always denied it, Diogo López Pacheco himself, pounced like hungry wolves on the defenseless Inés. There was no formal trial, no opportunity for defense, not even the slightest shadow of a legal process that could justify such an atrocity. It was a cold-blooded, brutal, cowardly, and premeditated murder. The chronicles and subsequent accounts differ in the exact details of the execution, as is often the case when horror mixes with legend. Some versions, the most gruesome and perhaps the most widely circulated, speak of her being repeatedly stabbed in the chest, her heart literally pierced by the sharp daggers of her executioners, in an act of savagery that sought not only to take her life, but also to symbolically destroy the organ that had harbored her love for Pedro. Others, perhaps more in line with the judicial practice of the time for certain crimes considered treason or high treason, suggest that she was beheaded there, in the gardens or in some interior room of the villa, in the presence of her terrified children, or at least in the immediate vicinity, so that the message of terror would be even more forceful. The exact place of her martyrdom, whether in the flower-filled gardens, next to the fountain that would weep eternal tears, or in the cold intimacy of a room, has become over the centuries a sanctuary of legend, a place that is both sacred and cursed, forever woven into the popular imagination with the innocent blood of Inés. Her last words, if she was able to utter any amid the panic and excruciating pain of her wounds, were lost in the tumult, drowned out by the heart-rending cries of her children and the grunts of effort and hatred of her murderers. What is certain, what is undeniable, is that there, on the banks of the tranquil Mondego River, on a gray and fateful day in January, the life of Inés de Castro, the beautiful heron's neck, was brutally cut short, cut off in the prime of her youth. Her body, once an object of desire, admiration, and envy, lay on the ground, lifeless, bloodied, abandoned like a piece of trash, while her young children were forcibly removed from the macabre scene by the king's servants. Alfonso IV, once the crime that would stain his name for eternity had been committed, withdrew with his men, leaving behind a trail of horror, desolation, and a thirst for revenge that burned with unquenchable fury in the heart of his son. The murder of Inés de Castro was not just the death of a woman, however beloved she may have been. It was the spark that ignited one of the most ferocious and legendary vendettas in history, elevating its victim to the status of an immortal myth, an eternal symbol of tragic love. The last night had fallen, dark and final, on the unfortunate Inés, and the final blow, cruel and accurate, had been dealt with a coldness that cried out to heaven and would soon receive its terrible earthly response. The news of the brutal and cowardly murder of Inés de Castro, perpetrated in cold blood on the direct orders of King Alfonso IV, and carried out with sadistic efficiency by his closest and most sinister advisors, reached the ears of the Infante Don Pedro like a bolt of lightning that splits the soul in two and burns reason to its foundations. If the love that the prince felt for the beautiful Galician woman had been a bonfire of burning and uncontrollable passion during her lifetime, the pain, rage, and fury that took hold of him upon confirmation of her death turned into a devastating fire, a conflagration of primal hatred and insatiable thirst for revenge that threatened to consume the very pillars of the Kingdom of Portugal. Pedro, who according to most historical sources was absent from Coimbra at the time of the crime, perhaps on one of his usual prolonged hunting trips, or attending to government affairs elsewhere in the country, an absence that was undoubtedly exploited by his enemies to carry out their plans, returned hastily to the city on the Mondego River, alerted by rumors or desperate messengers, only to find himself faced with the most horrific and unimaginable of realities. His beloved Inés, the light of his eyes, the center of his universe, lay dead, her body desecrated by the violence of her murderers, and her young children, the fruits of his love, now orphaned by the unheard-of cruelty of their own grandfather. The transformation that took place in the soul and character of the infant Pedro was terrible, instantaneous, and absolute. The young prince, until then known for his passionate and sometimes irascible temperament, but also for a certain indolence or disinterest in the most important affairs of state, was transformed overnight into a wounded beast, a man possessed, consumed by a single, all-consuming purpose that clouded all other considerations: to avenge the atrocious death of Inés and punish her murderers in the most exemplary, public, and bloody manner possible. His pain was so deep, so visceral, that it manifested itself in cold, calculating rage. He flatly refused to listen to any attempt at justification on the part of his father, the king, whom he considered from that moment on to be the main and most despicable person responsible for the crime. The relationship between father and son, which had been tense and difficult for years precisely because of the Inés affair, was broken irrevocably and irreparably. There could be no forgiveness for such an affront. Pedro, in an act of open and declared rebellion unprecedented in the recent history of Portugal, took up arms against his own father and sovereign, plunging the kingdom into a brief but bloody and destructive civil war that lasted, with interruptions, between 1355 and 1356. Supported by some nobles who sympathized with his cause, or who simply saw the conflict as an opportunity to advance politically or settle old scores, and with the invaluable help of Inés's powerful brothers, the Castros, who from Castile also clamored for revenge for their sister's death, Pedro ravaged with fire and sword the lands and possessions of those nobles who had supported the king or who had participated in the conspiracy against Inés, especially those of the three advisors directly involved in the murder. Peace, or rather a precarious truce fraught with resentment, was only achieved after arduous negotiations and thanks to the mediating intervention of Queen Beatrice, wife of Alfonso IV and mother of Pedro, a pious and respected woman who, with tears in her eyes and a broken heart, managed to stand between father and son to prevent further bloodshed and the possible disintegration of the kingdom. Pedro finally agreed to lay down his arms and apparently reconcile with his father, but with the implicit condition, unwritten but understood by all, that once he ascended the throne, he would have complete freedom to mete out his own particular justice to Inés's murderers. King Alfonso IV, old, tired, worn down by the conflict with his son, and according to some chroniclers, tormented in his last months by the weight of guilt and the ghost of Inés, died shortly afterwards, in May 1357. His death definitively paved the way for his son's ascension to the throne, who would be crowned Pedro Bermúdez of Portugal, a king who would go down in history with two epithets that perfectly sum up the terrifying duality of his character and his reign: the just, for his zeal in administering swift and often relentless justice, and the cruel, for the bloody and sometimes sadistic methods he used to punish his enemies, especially those who had played a part in the death of his beloved. No sooner had he placed the royal crown on his head than Pedro Bermúdez devoted himself with a methodical, cold, and fierce obsession to the priority task of hunting down Inés's murderers. Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco, fully aware of what was coming with the new king, had fled Portugal as soon as they heard of Alfonso IV's death, seeking refuge in the neighboring and often turbulent kingdom of Castile, then ruled by another Pedro Bermúdez, also known ironically as the Cruel or the Avenger. The new king of Portugal, using all the levers of diplomacy, political pressure, and according to some, substantial bribes, and taking advantage of a pre-existing agreement between the two kingdoms on the extradition of fugitives, or perhaps forging a new one, he managed to get the King of Castile to capture and hand over Pero Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves. Diogo López Pacheco, the third of those involved, more astute, with better contacts or simply luckier, managed to escape from Castile before being captured and found refuge first in Aragon and later in France, thus saving his life, although he would live the rest of his days as an outlaw, always looking over his shoulder. The fate of Coelho and Gonçalves, on the other hand, was gruesome, a prime example of Pedro Werman's swift and terrible justice. The Portuguese king was not interested in a formal trial with lawyers and evidence. For him, the guilt of both men was clear, and his verdict had already been decided years ago by his unquenchable pain and insatiable thirst for revenge. According to the chronicles of the time, with chilling detail, and although some modern historians tend to qualify or doubt the most gruesome aspects of the account, the execution of the two assassins, carried out in Santarém in 1361, was a spectacle of unprecedented cruelty, meticulously designed to satisfy the king's accumulated fury and to serve as a terrible warning to anyone else who dared to challenge his will or touch his loved ones. It is said that Pedro Werman personally presided over the torture, observing every detail with cold, almost scientific attention. One of them, Paco Coelho, accused of being the main instigator and of having struck at the heart of royal politics with his advice, had his heart torn out from behind while he was still alive and fully conscious, as a symbolic punishment for betraying the trust of the previous king and for advising the death of Inés. The other, Álvaro Gonçalves, guilty of having participated directly in the execution, had his heart torn out of his chest, in a macabre and terrible parallel to the suffering that his action had inflicted on Pedro's own heart. The most gruesome legend, which seeks to highlight the king's almost animalistic ferocity in his revenge, even goes so far as to claim that Pedro Werman, in a fit of insane rage, bit the still warm and bleeding hearts of his victims. While this last detail is probably a later exaggeration, intended to demonize or glorify, depending on one's perspective, the figure of the king, there is no doubt that the execution was extremely brutal and served to indelibly cement his reputation as cruel. But Pedro's revenge, terrible as it was, did not stop there, with the simple physical elimination of the executioners. He needed something more, something that transcended flesh and blood, something that would restore Inés's tarnished honor, that would legitimize his love before the world, and above all, before himself and posterity. And so, in an act that defies reason, that delves into the darkest and most fascinating territories of the human psyche, and that has fueled legend for centuries, Pedro Werman of Portugal carried out one of the most bizarre, moving, and macabre episodes in the entire history of universal royalty, the posthumous coronation of Inés de Castro. In 1360, 5 years after her brutal murder, and shortly before the execution of her murderers, Pedro Werman solemnly declared before the Cortes of the kingdom gathered in Cantanhede that he had secretly married Inés de Castro years earlier, before her death, in a ceremony held in Bragança. This declaration, sworn and endorsed by carefully selected witnesses, such as his chaplain and some trusted servants, thus retrospectively and by royal decree made Inés his legitimate wife and therefore Queen of Portugal. Immediately afterwards, to give tangible and terrifying substance to this proclamation, he ordered the exhumation of Inés's body from the monastery of Santa Clara in Coimbra, where she had been initially buried. The mortal remains of his beloved, already in an advanced state of decomposition after 5 years underground, were carefully washed, anointed with perfumes and balms, dressed in the richest royal garments befitting a queen, adorned with dazzling jewels, and finally seated on a throne next to his, in a solemn and ghostly ceremony held, according to some versions, in the Cathedral of Coimbra, or, according to others, in the monastery of Alcobaça itself, where they would be buried permanently. There, before a horrified court, overwhelmed and absolutely subjugated to the iron will of their king, Pedro Werman forced the nobles of the kingdom, the prelates of the church, the representatives of the cities, one by one, to pay due homage to the dead queen, to kneel before her, to bow their heads in a sign of vassalage, and to kiss the hem of her royal dress, or, according to the most gruesome and persistent versions of the legend, her bony, cold, and jeweled hand. The queen's corpse, with the crown placed on her mortal remains, presided over that unreal ceremony, a silent and chilling testimony to the obsessive love of a king and his relentless and theatrical desire for justice. Pedro's emotional chaos, his unquenchable grief turned into a form of lucid and ceremonial madness, had found its catharsis, its apotheosis, in that act unprecedented in history. Inés de Castro, the Galician mistress murdered for reasons of state, finally reigned, from beyond the grave, over the kingdom of Portugal. The fate of her corpse, however, had not yet concluded its long and macabre journey. A final and sumptuous resting place awaited her. The macabre and shocking ceremony of Inés de Castro's posthumous coronation, that unheard-of act that froze the blood of the Portuguese court and resonated with a mixture of astonishment, disbelief, and horror throughout the chancelleries of medieval Europe, was not, however, the final chapter in the extraordinary and tragic story of her mortal remains, nor was it the last manifestation of Pedro Brum's obsessive and enduring devotion to her memory. After that theatrical affirmation of his love and Inés's royalty, the king, already known as much for his relentless justice as for his calculated cruelty, embarked on a monumental project that would not only honor the memory of his beloved, but also perpetuate their tragic love story for eternity, inscribing it in stone so that future generations could contemplate it and be moved by it. The construction of two magnificent and elaborate tombs in the transept of the imposing church of the royal monastery of Santa Maria de Alcobaça, one of the most important and venerated royal pantheons in Portugal. These tombs, considered today to be authentic masterpieces of late Portuguese Gothic sculpture, were not conceived as mere receptacles to house their lifeless bodies, but as an artistic and symbolic testament to their tragic and passionate love story, and as a coded message, full of hidden meanings and transcendent hopes, for posterity. According to documents from the time, Pedro personally supervised the design and execution of the tombs in minute detail, commissioning the best stonemasons and sculptors of his time, probably some of foreign origin given the quality and style of the work. His and Inés's tombs were designed not to lie side by side, as was customary in many royal pantheons, but to be placed face to face, in an unusual arrangement laden with symbolism, with the feet of both effigies facing each other so that, according to the moving and romantic legend that has come down to us, on the day of judgment, when the dead rise to the sound of heavenly trumpets, the first thing they will see when they rise from their stone beds will be the eyes of their beloved, their gazes meeting again at the very threshold of eternity. A final and sublime gesture of romantic love, a proof of faith in the resurrection of the flesh and in the survival of love beyond the barriers of death, which was projected with hope towards eternity. Between 1361 and 1362, once the sumptuous tomb intended for Inés was completely finished and ready to receive her remains, they were transferred from Coimbra, where they had remained since her exhumation and posthumous coronation, to the monastery of Alcobaça. It was not a furtive or discreet burial, as might have been expected for such a controversial figure, but quite the opposite. A funeral procession of unprecedented magnificence and solemnity in the history of Portugal, as if it were the funeral of a reigning queen, loved and revered by her people. The coffin, covered with rich brocade and velvet, and probably bearing some effigy or image of Inés, was escorted by hundreds of court knights, nobles, and prelates, all carrying lit torches that illuminated the way in the night, creating an impressive serpent of fire and mourning that slowly traveled the distance between the two cities. The common people, moved by the tragedy of the murdered young queen and by the palpable and heartbreaking devotion of their king, came out to greet him in the villages and towns along the way to pay a final silent tribute to the memory of the dead queen, throwing flowers, saying prayers, and weeping for her unfortunate fate. When they finally arrived at the monastery of Alcobaça, after several days of slow and solemn pilgrimage, Inés's body was laid to rest with full honors in her splendid tomb. A true work of art in fine white stone, finely carved with an astonishing profusion of details. On its sides are scenes from the life of Christ, such as the Last Supper and the Crucifixion, as well as an impressive and detailed vision of the Last Judgment, with angels, demons, the blessed, and the damned. Significantly, the coat of arms of the Castro family appears intertwined with that of the Royal House of Portugal, in a clear message of legitimacy and union. On the lid of the tomb, a recumbent effigy of Inés is depicted, not as a decomposed corpse, but as a young queen, serene and of idealized beauty, with a slight and enigmatic smile on her lips, dressed in rich garments and with the royal crown on her head, while her figure is delicately supported and veiled by 6 angels who seem to guard her eternal sleep. Years later, upon his death in 1367, Pedro I, the just, the cruel, the passionate, would be buried, according to his express and meticulous instructions, in his own no less magnificent tomb, directly opposite that of Inés, so that his stony gaze could meet hers for all eternity. His tomb, equally impressive in its design and execution, is decorated with scenes of hunting, his favorite pastime, with episodes of battles in which he participated, and most notably, with a complex representation of the Wheel of Fortune, symbol of the vanity of worldly glories and the vicissitudes of fate, and with reliefs narrating the life and martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew, his patron saint, perhaps an allusion to the torments he himself had inflicted. The recumbent image of the king shows him with a split beard, a traditional sign of perpetual mourning at the time, which he kept for Inés for the rest of his life, and with a severe, stern, almost fierce expression, that of a man who has known the most sublime love and the deepest hatred, and who has dispensed justice without wavering. Together, but eternally separated by the narrow aisle of the church transept, the two lovers would finally rest, united in death as they could not be fully and peacefully in life, and guarded forever by the imposing and silent Gothic architecture of Alcobaça. The legacy of Inés de Castro and Pedro Braumer, however, transcended the cold stone of their tombs and the sacred walls of the monastery. Their story, with all its elements of forbidden and adulterous love, palace intrigue and reasons of state, excessive cruelty, relentless revenge, and post-mortem devotion bordering on necrophilia, almost immediately became a powerful and enduring myth, an inexhaustible source of inspiration for literature, music, painting, opera, and theater, not only in Portugal, where it is rightly considered one of the founding narratives of national identity, a story that embodies the Portuguese soul with its mixture of saudade, passion, and tragedy, but throughout Europe and over time, the entire world. From medieval chroniclers such as Fernão Lopes, who in the 15th century recorded the events in vibrant prose and with remarkable fidelity to the sources, although unable to avoid the echo of legend, to the great poets of the Renaissance such as the incomparable Luís Vaz de Camões, who immortalized its tragedy in Canto Terceiro of his national epic Os Lusíadas, with those famous and moving verses. Assim como a bonina que cortada, antes do tempo foi, cândida e bela. Like the bonina flower that was cut before its time, candid and beautiful. The figure of Inés has been sung, mourned, exalted, and reinterpreted throughout the centuries by countless artists. Spanish playwrights such as Luis Vélez de Guevara, with his Reinar después de morir, to reign after death, French writers such as Henri de Montherlant, and even English writers brought her passionate and terrible story to the stage, moving audiences of all ages. Romantic and academic painters, seduced by the drama of the story, captured on their canvases the ethereal beauty of Inés, the cold cruelty of her murderers, the furious despair of Pedro, and the macabre scene of the posthumous coronation. Her death and Pedro's subsequent terrible revenge still raise profound and disturbing questions about the nature of power, the limits of justice, the weight of reason of state against individual rights, and the capacity of human beings for the most sublime love and the most abject cruelty. The story of Inés de Castro reminds us, with a force that has lost none of its relevance, that love, in its most intense and true forms, can challenge the most deeply rooted social conventions and the most absolute political powers, but also that this challenge, in a world ruled by interests and ambitions, can have terrible and fatal consequences. It speaks to us, with the eloquence of tragedy, of the fragility of human life, especially that of women in vulnerable positions, in the face of the cold calculations of politics, and of how the memory of a flagrant injustice can fuel the desire for revenge to unimaginable extremes, transforming a just man into a relentless executioner. But above all, and perhaps this explains its survival in the collective imagination, its story is a heart-rending and eternal ode to the persistence of love beyond the barriers of death, a love that, through art, legend, and the silent testimony of those two facing tombs in Alcobaça, has managed to overcome oblivion and continue to move the hearts of those who hear or read it, century after century. And so, in the majestic and venerable silence of the monastery of Alcobaza, the effigies of Pedro and Inés gaze at each other across time, perhaps awaiting that final judgment in which, according to the faith of their time and the hope of their love, all truths will finally be revealed, and all earthly injustices will find their definitive redress. Their story, like an underground river, continues to flow in the consciousness of the West, resonating to this day, inviting us to reflect on the untamed passions that move the world and on the price, often too high, that must be paid for them. What do you think, viewer of this remote but ever-present tragedy, about this ending, about this story of love and death that defies the limits of belief and confronts us with the deepest contradictions of the human soul? Was Pedro's revenge a form of poetic justice, a necessary catharsis for a broken heart, or simply a spiral of violence that perpetuated horror and barbarism? I invite you to leave your thoughts, feelings, and opinions in the comments section below this article. And if these stories, which fearlessly delve into the darkest, most passionate, and most moving corners of history, challenge you, move you, or make you think, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, to show your appreciation, and share this story so that more restless and curious souls can learn the truths, often bitter but always fascinating, that lie hidden behind the veils of time. Together, we will continue to uncover the echoes that history, with its lights and shadows, has left imprinted on the memory of eternity.